It weighs just over 14 pounds, less than a well-fed house cat, and is small enough to be held quite comfortably in 2 human hands. Its surface, a lustrous nickel plating, gleams with a cool, indifferent perfection, machined to tolerances so fine they defy the naked eye. To touch it is to feel a faint, almost imperceptible warmth, a subtle exhalation from its dense, metallic heart, a constant, quiet reminder of the elemental power bound within. It has no moving parts, it makes no sound. It looks for all the world like a piece of abstract sculpture, a flawless sphere that could be a paperweight on the desk of a titan of industry, or a gazing ball for a fortune teller with cosmic ambitions. But you're not looking at an inert object. You're looking at a killer. You're looking at a meticulously crafted instrument of apocalypse, a tiny man-made star forged in the crucible of war and brought to rest here in the high desert of New Mexico. This is the 3rd core ever created by humanity. A solid sphere of plutonium-gallium alloy, it was originally destined for a terrible purpose, intended to be the fissionable heart of the 3rd atomic bomb, meant to be dropped on a city that would never know its name. History, however, intervened. The surrender of Japan made its violent mission obsolete, leaving this orb of distilled annihilation without a purpose, an orphan of the war it was built to end. Yet, in the strange, suspended peace of late 1945, it would find a new, more intimate and arguably more sinister calling. It would become a scientific relic of unparalleled importance and a gravitational centre for tragedy. In the laboratories of Los Alamos, among the brilliant young men who had just helped win the war, it earned a new name. They didn't call it by its technical designation, RU-239. They called it Rufus. And then, after it began to claim its victims, they called it something else. They called it the Demon Core. This is its story. It is a story about the seduction of a knowledge and the terrible price of curiosity. It's a story of what happens when the most brilliant minds of a generation, flush with a success so profound it altered the course of human history, come face to face with a power they understand in theory, but whose lethal immediacy they have yet to truly respect. It is a ghost story told with the language of physics, a cautionary tale written in gamma rays and neutrons, a microscopic drama that played out on a laboratory bench with consequences that ripple through our understanding of science, risk, and the very nature of human fallibility. To understand how this polished sphere became a harbinger of death, we must first return to the place where it was born and where it held court, a secret city perched on a volcanic plateau, a place that existed on no public map, a scientific monastery dedicated to a single terrifying prayer, Los Alamos. Even the name sounds like a whisper, a place of secrets and shadows. In the aftermath of the Trinity test and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this isolated mesa was the most advanced, most dangerous and most exhilarating place on Earth. The war was over, but the work here, the work of the atom, had only just begun. The frantic, world-saving urgency of the Manhattan Project had receded, replaced by a different kind of pressure, a cold, methodical, and in many ways more perilous exploration into the fundamental forces they had so recently unleashed. Imagine the atmosphere. The air itself, thin and crisp at 7,000 feet, still crackled with the energy of revelation. These scientists, many of them barely out of their 20s, had become the new wizards of the modern age. They had summoned a genie from the bottle of the periodic table, and now, in the quiet after the storm, they were determined to learn all its secrets, to map its every mood, to understand the very grammar of its power. There was an intoxicating blend of academic freedom and military discipline, a campus of Nobel laureates surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. They were pioneers on the shores of a new and terrifying continent, and this plutonium core was their Rosetta Stone. It was a key that could unlock a deeper understanding of nuclear chain reactions, the very engine that powered the stars and now, the arsenals of mankind. Every experiment they conducted with it was a step into virgin territory. They were writing the textbooks as they went along, their laboratory benches the front lines of the Cold War's first silent campaign. The sense of exceptionalism was palpable. These were men who had stared into the heart of creation and had not blinked. They had bent the fundamental laws of the universe to their will. A certain kind of intellectual arrogance was not just tolerated, it was almost a prerequisite. They were the best and the brightest, and they knew it. An environment like this breeds a unique culture of risk. The normal boundaries of caution can become blurred, seen as impediments to progress, the timid hesitations of a lesser intellect. When you routinely work with materials that can erase a city, the danger of a single, momentary slip of the hand can become abstract, a mathematical probability rather than a visceral, gut-wrenching threat. They developed a professional intimacy with the apocalypse. They handled uranium and plutonium with the casual confidence of a master carpenter handling a familiar tool. This plutonium sphere was the most exotic and potent tool in their entire collection, and it demanded a very specific, very dangerous kind of investigation. To truly understand its properties, they couldn't just study it from a distance. They had to wake it up. Not fully, not violently, but just enough to make it stir in its slumber, to bring it to the very precipice of its awesome potential. This delicate and perilous procedure was known by a nickname that perfectly captured its swashbuckling, almost mythical nature. They called it tickling the dragon's tail. The dragon, in this analogy, was the state of criticality. This is the magical threshold where a mass of fissile material, like our plutonium core, can sustain a nuclear chain reaction. Below this threshold, the core is subcritical. It is warm, it is radioactive, but it is relatively stable. Stray neutrons born from spontaneous fission might trigger a few other atoms to split, but the reaction quickly fizzles out. The dragon is asleep, but if you bring the core closer to that critical point, something extraordinary begins to happen. You can do this by surrounding it with other materials that act like mirrors for neutrons. Instead of escaping out into the room, the neutrons are reflected back into the core, where they are more likely to strike other plutonium atoms, releasing more neutrons which are then reflected back in, and so on. The process snowballs. The core begins to hum with activity. The faint whisper of fission becomes a roar. The dragon is stirring. Its tail begins to lash. Go just a fraction too far, close the gap by the width of a human hair, and you pass the point of no return. You achieve prompt criticality. The chain reaction becomes exponential, unstoppable. In a fraction of a microsecond, the core releases a spectacular, lethal burst of energy. Not an explosion in the conventional sense, but an invisible flash flood of gamma rays and a blizzard of neutron radiation pouring out into the room at nearly the speed of light. The dragon is fully awake. And anyone in its presence is already dead. They just don't know it yet. The goal of these experiments, the entire purpose of tickling the dragon, was to find that edge with microscopic precision, to push the core right up to the brink of criticality, to get it to 99.9% of its potential, and then pull back, all while taking measurements. It was the ultimate high-wire act of nuclear physics, performed without a net. And shockingly, in those early days, it was often performed by hand. In a quiet room, a single scientist would manually assemble the neutron reflecting blocks around the plutonium sphere. They would use their own hands to manipulate the components, relying on their skill, their nerve, and their deep understanding of the physics to keep the dragon at bay. They were cosmic toreadors, waving a cape of tungsten carbide in the face of an atomic bull. It was a deeply personal, tactile form of science, a universe away from the remote-controlled, heavily shielded experiments of today. It was a science that demanded a steady hand, an unblinking eye, and an almost reckless degree of self-confidence. It was a science perfectly suited to the ethos of Los Alamos in 1946, and it was a science that would draw two brilliant young physicists into its fatal embrace. Their names were Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin. They were archetypes of this new atomic age, young, fiercely intelligent, ambitious, and utterly fearless. Daghlian was a quiet, meticulous prodigy from Purdue, a thoughtful physicist known for his careful work and his deep fascination with the raw, untamed forces he studied. Slotin, a charismatic Canadian, was the opposite in temperament. He was the laboratory's resident expert on critical assemblies, a confident, swaggering showman of a scientist who treated the deadly apparatus with a theatrical disdain for its danger. He was famous for his hands-on approach, eschewing safety protocols and remote manipulators for the direct feel of the components, a practice that thrilled his younger colleagues and unnerved some of his more seasoned superiors. He was the undisputed master of tickling the dragon. For these two men, the plutonium core wasn't a demon. It was a challenge. It was a puzzle box containing the fundamental secrets of the universe, and they were convinced they were the ones who could unlock it. They were driven by the purest of scientific motives, the desire to know, to understand, to peel back one more layer of reality and gaze upon the workings of the cosmos. But in their quest, in that high, lonely laboratory, they were approaching a boundary not found in any physics textbook. A boundary between courage and hubris, between pioneering research and a fatal gamble. This plutonium sphere, sitting silent and patient on its laboratory stand, was more than just a scientific artifact. It was a test. It was a mirror reflecting the aspirations and the blind spots of the men who handled it. It asked a silent, profound question of anyone who dared to approach it. Do you truly comprehend the power you are holding? Do you respect the infinitesimal gap that separates a groundbreaking experiment from a lethal accident? For Harry Daghlian, and, 9 months later, for Louis Slotin, the answer would come in a sudden, silent, and horrifyingly intimate way. It would come in a flash of ethereal blue light. It would come as a strange metallic taste on the tongue. It would come as a wave of heat that felt like a sudden severe sunburn. In those terrible fleeting moments, the dragon would wake up, and the world of theoretical physics would collide with the brutal reality of biological destruction. This is the story of those moments. It is the story of how a 14-pound ball of metal became the focus of 2 agonizing deaths, forcing a generation of scientists to confront the human cost of their own genius. We will investigate the 2 incidents, minute by agonizing minute, not just as accidents, but as crucial turning points in our relationship with the atom. Were these men martyrs to science, tragic victims of the unknown? Or were they casualties of a culture of haste and pride, a culture that, in its rush to conquer the atom, forgot the simple, humbling truth that some dragons should be left to sleep? The answers lie within the story of this sphere, an object of sublime scientific beauty and of profound, unforgettable terror. In the high desert summer of 1945, a world war was dying in fire and thunder. Across the globe, empires that had stood for 1,000 years were turning to ash, and the exhausted victors were beginning to count their dead. But here, on a remote mesa in New Mexico, hidden from the eyes of the world, a different kind of fire was being kindled. This was not a war of armies, but a war of atoms, fought in secret laboratories by men and women armed with slide rules and genius. This was Project Y, the beating heart of the Manhattan Project. This was Los Alamos. From the outside, it was a ramshackle town of mud and hastily built barracks, a place that did not officially exist, a secret whispered on the wind. But inside its guarded fences, a stellar constellation of minds had been gathered, a collection of Nobel laureates and brilliant young prodigies, all conscripted into the single greatest scientific undertaking in human history. Their purpose was both simple and monstrous: to build a weapon that could weaponize the very energy that forged the stars. They were tasked with unlocking a power that, until now, had belonged only to the realm of gods and speculative physics. They were building the atomic bomb. By August, 2 bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man, had already been used, unleashing their terrible new physics upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war in the Pacific was shuddering to its inevitable, violent conclusion. Yet the work at Los Alamos did not stop. The frantic pace, the sense of existential urgency, did not relent. A 3rd bomb was being prepared, a 3rd core of fissile material assembled, ready for a potential 3rd strike if Japan's surrender did not materialize. This core, a dense warm sphere of man-made plutonium alloyed with gallium, was a masterpiece of metallurgy and nuclear engineering, polished to a mirror shine, perfectly round, weighing just over 14 pounds. It was a piece of refined, distilled apocalypse, an object that held within its deceptively small volume the promise of unimaginable energy and the seed of unspeakable death. It was nicknamed Rufus at the time, but history would give it a far more sinister name. To understand the profound danger cradled in that small sphere, you have to understand the invisible law that governs it. It is a concept that exists on a knife's edge, a boundary line drawn between the inert and the cataclysmic, between potential and annihilation. This singular, terrifying threshold is known as criticality. Imagine a vast, impossibly dry forest stretching to every horizon. This is our plutonium core. Each tree is a single, unstable plutonium atom ready to split apart. Now imagine a single, stray spark, a free neutron drifting on the breeze. If that neutron strikes a tree, the tree bursts into flame, releasing a tremendous wave of heat and, crucially, 2 or 3 more sparks. This is fission. If those new sparks fly off and fail to hit any other trees, the fire dies out. The reaction fizzles. The forest remains quiet. This state is called subcritical. The material is active, it is radioactive, but it is fundamentally stable. It is a sleeping dragon, its furnace heart beating low and slow. But what if you could change the conditions? What if you could build walls around a section of that forest, walls that reflect the sparks back into the woods instead of letting them escape? Suddenly the odds change dramatically. Now, when a tree ignites, its sparks are bounced back, far more likely to strike other trees. The fire begins to sustain itself. The moment when each burning tree ignites exactly one other tree on average, creating a perfectly stable, self-perpetuating chain reaction, is criticality. The atomic fire is lit. It does not grow, but it does not die. It is a state of exquisite, perfect, and perilous balance. The dragon is no longer sleeping. Its eyes are open. It is watching. It is at this precise point that a nuclear reactor operates, carefully harnessing the steady, controlled release of atomic energy. But the scientists at Los Alamos were not building a reactor. They were building a bomb. They needed to go beyond that stable equilibrium. They needed to create a state where each exploding atom triggers not one, but many more, in a fraction of a microsecond. A cascade of fission that grows exponentially, uncontrollably, instantaneously. A raging, unstoppable atomic inferno. This is supercriticality. The dragon does not just awaken, it unleashes its full, annihilating fury. The challenge for the bomb makers was twofold and paradoxical. First, they had to design a device that could keep the plutonium core safely subcritical for storage and transport, preventing any accidental chain reaction. Second, they had to engineer a trigger, a system of conventional explosives, that could, at the exact right moment, crush the plutonium sphere, increasing its density and slamming it into a supercritical state with absolute precision. To do that, to build that trigger and to understand the core itself, they needed to know exactly where that razor's edge of criticality was. How close could you get before the dragon stirred? How much persuasion did it take to push it over the edge? Answering this question was not a matter of abstract theory. It couldn't be solved with chalk on a blackboard. It required direct physical experimentation with the deadliest materials ever created. It required someone to walk into a room, take the fate of the world in their hands and tickle the dragon's tail. This was the work of the Critical Assembly Group at Omega Site, a small isolated laboratory a few miles from the main town. Here, a team of young, brilliant, and astonishingly brave physicists performed some of the most dangerous experiments ever conceived. They were the elite, the daredevils of the nuclear age, playing a high-stakes game of chicken with fundamental physics. Their work was unglamorous, conducted in a stark, unadorned concrete building that felt more like a bunker than a laboratory. The air hummed with the quiet clicks of neutron detectors, the only audible sign of the invisible tempest of particles that saturated every cubic inch of the space. In this room, the raw materials of nuclear annihilation were treated with a strange mixture of profound respect and startling familiarity. And among this band of pioneers, 2 men stood out. 2 men whose destinies would become inextricably, fatally, entwined with the plutonium core that waited there. The first was Daghlian, the son of Armenian immigrants. He was just 24 years old, a quiet, intensely focused physicist who had been recruited to Los Alamos straight from Purdue University. He was meticulous, careful, and deeply respected for his intuitive grasp of the strange new world of neutron physics. Colleagues described him as thoughtful and reserved, a man who understood the immense gravity of their work, who felt the weight of the invisible forces he was manipulating every single day. He was not a showman, he was a pure scientist, driven by a deep-seated need to understand, to measure, to quantify the unknown. He saw the plutonium core not as a monster to be tamed, but as a profound cosmic puzzle to be solved, and he approached it with the caution and precision of a bomb disposal expert. He was acutely aware that a single miscalculation, a moment of distraction, a slip of the hand, could lead to a disaster beyond imagination. His work was his life, a patriotic duty married to an insatiable intellectual curiosity, a combination that defined the very spirit of Los Alamos. The second man was Louis Slotin. If Daghlian was the cautious intellectual, Slotin was the swashbuckling adventurer. A charismatic Canadian, with a doctorate from King's College London, Slotin was renowned for his extraordinary expertise with critical assemblies. He was the lab's chief bomb put-togetherer, the man who had assembled the core of the Trinity test device, the very first atomic bomb detonated a month earlier. He possessed a bold, almost reckless confidence, an unshakable belief in his own skill and intuition. He had a flair for the dramatic, a cowboy swagger that made him a legend among the younger physicists. Where others saw unacceptable risk, Slotin saw a challenge to be mastered. He developed a reputation for being the fastest and most daring experimenter, able to get the delicate measurements done with an efficiency that bordered on artistry. He saw himself as a master of the atomic beast, a dragon tamer who knew its moods, its temper, its breaking point. He treated the deadly materials with a casual, hands-on intimacy that both impressed and unnerved his colleagues, some of whom privately worried that his bravado would one day betray him. Together, Daghlian and Slotin were at the forefront of the quest to map the precise behaviour of these new artificial elements. The experiments they performed were terrifying in their simplicity. They would take the plutonium sphere, the core, and place it on a small stand. This sphere by itself was subcritical. It was dangerous, yes, but it was stable. The forest was too sparse. Too many neutron sparks were escaping. The goal of the experiment was to surround the core with materials that would act as neutron reflectors, the walls around our imaginary forest. These reflectors were heavy, dense bricks made of tungsten carbide, a material exceptionally good at bouncing stray neutrons back toward the plutonium. The experimenter would manually, by hand, stack these bricks around the core one by one. With each added brick, the walls of the forest grew higher. More neutrons were reflected back. The internal activity of the core would increase. The clicking of the nearby neutron counters, the only sensory guide in this dance with unseen forces, would begin to quicken. Click, 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 click. It was the sound of an atomic heartbeat growing stronger, faster, more frantic. The physicists were listening to the dragon begin to stir in its slumber. Their job was to bring the assembly as close to criticality as possible, without ever actually crossing the line. They would push it to 95% of critical, 98%, even 99%, nudging the system to the very precipice of a runaway chain reaction. They would hold it there, suspended in a state of near-atomic chaos, long enough to take their measurements to understand its properties. Then, they would carefully pull back, disassembling the reflector bricks and allowing the dragon to fall back into its uneasy sleep. This was tickling the dragon's tail. It was a procedure that left absolutely no room for error. The gap between a successful experiment and a lethal burst of radiation was measured in millimeters. The margin of safety was the steadiness of a physicist's own hand. There were no robotic arms, no remote control systems, no lead-lined shields separating the man from the material. It was an intimate, tactile, and profoundly personal encounter with the bomb. You had to feel the weight of the bricks, to see the glint of the plutonium, to hear the rising chorus of the counters with your own ears. In the feverish atmosphere of wartime Los Alamos, this was simply how science was done. They were in a race, and safety protocols were often seen as cumbersome delays. These men were not fools. They were brilliant minds who understood the dangers better than anyone on Earth. But they were also young, driven by patriotism, ambition, and the intoxicating thrill of exploring a completely new scientific frontier. They were charting the most perilous territory ever discovered, and they believed that their courage, their intelligence, and their skill were enough to keep them safe. They had convinced themselves that they could control the dragon, that they could walk right up to the gates of atomic hell, peer inside, and walk away unharmed. It was a belief born of confidence and necessity, a gamble they took day after day in that lonely concrete room on Omega Site. They were pushing the boundaries of knowledge, but they were also pushing their luck, farther and farther, unaware that the gleaming sphere at the centre of their experiments was not just a puzzle, but a patient predator, a demon core, waiting for its moment. It had already tasted destruction on the other side of the world. Soon it would turn on its own creators, and so the weapon that had missed its war sat in quiet repose, an orphan of history, waiting for a destiny that was no longer certain. To the uninitiated eye, it was an object of profound anticlimax, just a small, dense sphere of metal, barely 6 kilograms, warm to the touch from its own slow, inexorable decay. Polished to a dull, silvery sheen, it offered no hint of the stellar violence locked within its atomic architecture. There were no warning lights, no ominous hums, just a deceptively placid presence in the heart of a secret laboratory in the high desert of New Mexico. This was the artifact codenamed Rufus, but history would remember it by a more fitting name, the Demon Core. It was a sun in miniature, a nascent star forged not in the cosmos, but in the sprawling reactors at Hanford, its plutonium heart beating with a silent radioactive pulse. This sphere was the third nuclear pit ever created by humanity, a direct sibling to the ones that had immolated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It had been prepared for a third strike, a final, terrible blow against Japan that the nation's surrender had rendered unnecessary. Yet its existence posed a new, urgent set of questions that gnawed at the minds of the physicists at Los Alamos. They had built these devices under the incredible duress of global conflict, working with theoretical models and a terrifying degree of uncertainty. They knew the bombs worked. What they did not know, with the precision that science demanded, was the absolute razor's edge boundary between a dormant state and catastrophic explosive fury. They needed to find the threshold. They needed to know exactly how much provocation this sleeping demon could endure before it awoke. This quest for knowledge gave birth to some of the most perilous scientific inquiries ever conceived, the Criticality experiments. The concept itself is one of cosmic balance. Inside the plutonium sphere, atoms are constantly splitting, firing off subatomic particles called neutrons. In its subcritical state, most of these neutrons fly harmlessly out into the surrounding room, their energy dissipating without effect. The core is a leaky vessel, unable to sustain a chain reaction, but if you could somehow persuade those escaping neutrons to turn back, to reflect them into the plutonium heart, the internal chatter would grow. More neutrons would mean more split atoms, which would release even more neutrons, and so on. This escalating atomic conversation, a feedback loop of unimaginable speed, is the chain reaction. The point where it becomes perfectly self-sustaining, a balanced, steady-state hum of lethal energy, is called criticality. It is the tipping point, the moment a piece of metal becomes a nuclear reactor. Push it even a fraction further, into supercriticality, and you have a bomb. The task, then, was to bring the demon core to the very brink of that critical point, to nudge it, to tease it, to learn its secrets, and then pull back, all without tumbling over the precipice. The men of Los Alamos, brilliant minds who had wrestled with the fundamental forces of the universe on blackboards, now sought to perform this delicate dance using their own hands as their primary instruments. They called the procedure tickling the dragon's tail, a nickname that betrayed a chilling awareness of the stakes, a gallows humour that barely masked the visceral terror of their work. They were playing a game of nuclear chicken, and the price of flinching, or of a single slip, was not merely their own lives, but potentially the lives of everyone in the Pajarito Canyon complex. Imagine the scene. There is no gleaming automated containment chamber, no robotic arms performing these tasks from the safety of a shielded bunker. There is just a man, a simple metal stand, and the core. The laboratory itself is Spartan, a place of function over form, filled with the quiet clicks of Geiger counters that served as their only early warning system. To push the core towards criticality, the scientists surrounded it with materials that acted as neutron reflectors. These were the dragon's breath, materials dense enough to catch the fleeing neutrons and bounce them back into the plutonium. The choice of reflector was everything. Tungsten carbide, a brutally heavy and durable metal, was a favourite. So was beryllium, a surprisingly lightweight but exceptionally effective neutron mirror. One of the primary experiments involved slowly, painstakingly building a wall of these reflector bricks around the core. You must picture Harry Daghlian, a young, earnest physicist, performing this task. He would approach the assembly with a single, heavy brick of tungsten carbide in his hand. The core rests on its stand, silent, radiating a faint warmth. He places the first brick near it. The Geiger counters in the room, their rhythmic clicking a kind of ambient soundtrack to the tension, begin to chatter a little faster. A few more neutrons are being turned back. The dragon stirs in its sleep. He adds another brick carefully, his movements measured and precise. The clicks accelerate again, the sound coalescing into a more insistent buzz. He's not just listening to the counters, he's listening with his entire being. He feels the slight change in the air, the prickle of static electricity, the hum of invisible energies. He's using his own senses, his intuition honed by months of this work to gauge the core's response. He's judging the distance by eye, the placement by feel. The calculations on the blackboard gave him a theoretical boundary, a line he must not cross. But in this room, theory felt a world away. Here, there was only the physical reality of his hand, the dense weight of the brick, and the growing intensity of the radiation flooding the space around him. He inches another brick closer. The buzz from the counters sharpens into a high-pitched whine. This is the edge. This is the dragon's growl. He has found the limit for this configuration. He records his data, and then, just as carefully, he begins to disassemble his creation, brick by agonizing brick, letting the dragon fall back into its slumber. Every single one of these experiments was a manual override of the universe's most violent tendencies. The safety measures were shockingly primitive, often relying on nothing more than gravity. In some setups, the final, most critical piece of the reflector was suspended by a rope over the assembly, with a scientist standing by, axe in hand, ready to sever the line if the reaction began to run away. It was a setup that belonged more to a medieval siege than to a cutting-edge physics laboratory. It was an environment saturated with a unique and volatile cocktail of genius and hubris. These were the men who had, in the space of a few short years, unlocked a power previously reserved for the stars. They had won the war. A sense of intellectual invincibility permeated the culture of Los Alamos. They were the new masters of the atom, and in their confidence, they began to take shortcuts to treat the dragon not as a thing of terror, but as a familiar, if temperamental, pet. This audacious spirit was personified by the man who would become the core's most intimate dance partner, the brilliant, swaggering Canadian physicist Louis Slotin. Where Daghlian's method was a slow, careful construction, Slotin's was a feat of daring, almost theatrical manual dexterity. His preferred experiment became the stuff of legend at the lab. He would take the core and place it inside the bottom half of a hollow beryllium sphere, a reflector known as a tamper. He would then take the top half, another heavy beryllium hemisphere, and lower it over the core. If the two halves were to close completely, they would form a near-perfect neutron mirror. The core would be instantly smothered in its own reflected energy. The neutron population would explode, and a supercritical excursion, a blue flash of light, a wave of lethal radiation, would be inevitable. The assembly would become, for a fraction of a second, a functioning, albeit non-explosive nuclear bomb. To prevent this, to hold the reaction at the very precipice of criticality, Slotin would prop the two hemispheres apart with the most mundane of instruments, the blade of a standard, flathead screwdriver. Can you feel the sheer, unmitigated audacity of that? The fate of a city, the boundary between the subatomic and the apocalyptic, balanced on the tip of a tool you could find in any garage. With one hand, he would hold the heavy top hemisphere, feeling its weight, its potential. With the other, he would manipulate the screwdriver, twisting it ever so slightly, lowering the shell by fractions of a millimeter, forcing the two halves closer together. He would listen to the rising scream of the radiation detectors, watching his instruments, judging the exact moment to stop. He was a cosmic surgeon, performing open-heart surgery on a god, using a screwdriver as his only separator. He was a master of this terrifying craft. He had performed the demonstration dozens of times, becoming the laboratory's foremost expert. He was known for his coolness under pressure, for the casual confidence with which he approached the assembly. Newcomers and visiting dignitaries were often treated to the spectacle, watching in a state of mixed awe and horror as Slotin, often in his trademark blue jeans and cowboy boots, brought the core to life with a flick of his wrist. He was a virtuoso, and this was his instrument. But the performance relied on one critical, unspoken assumption, that the hand of the virtuoso would never tremble. It required a level of human perfection that the universe rarely permits. The system had no tolerance for error. There was no backup, no safety net, no fail-safe. The only thing separating a successful experiment from a lethal burst of gamma rays was the steady muscle fibre in one man's thumb and the friction between a steel screwdriver and a sphere of beryllium. This was the environment, an urgent post-war scramble for data, a profound underestimation of the lingering dangers, and a group of brilliant men who had grown accustomed to staring into the abyss and seeing it blink first. They pushed the boundaries not just of physics, but of prudence. They had built a world-ending weapon in secret, and now, in that same secrecy, they were prodding it, testing its limits with a familiarity that bred a fatal contempt. The core sat at the centre of it all, an impassive observer to their daring. It made no judgments. It harboured no malice. It simply obeyed the laws of physics, waiting patiently for the moment when the numbers would align, when the geometry would be perfect, when the hand of its caretaker would for just one fatal instant slip. And so, the war was over. The terrible fire that had consumed the world was extinguished, its final blinding embers having fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At Los Alamos, a strange quiet descended. The frantic, world-altering pace gave way to something else, a simmering, restless energy. The minds that had unlocked the atom were not yet ready to lay down their tools. They had created a new kind of star on Earth, and now, in the high desert of New Mexico, they felt an urge, a scientific compulsion, to understand its every flicker, its every breath. The work continued, not for war but for knowledge, but the object of their study, the gleaming sphere of plutonium, was indifferent to their intentions. It obeyed only the laws of physics, laws as ancient as the cosmos, and as unforgiving as death. The night of August 21st, 1945 was quiet, even by the standards of the isolated Omega Site Canyon. Inside a laboratory, starkly lit and smelling of ozone and metal, a young physicist was at work. His name was Harry Daghlian. Just 24 years old, he was brilliant, confident, a veteran of the Manhattan Project who had earned his place among the giants. Tonight, he was performing one of the most dangerous experiments conceivable, an experiment that the great Richard Feynman himself had called tickling the dragon's tail. The dragon, of course, was the core, not the one used in the Trinity test or dropped on Japan, but its sibling, a 6.2 kilogram sphere of plutonium-gallium alloy, a polished orb of latent power that would one day earn a far more sinister name. Daghlian was working alone. It was a minor breach of protocol, perhaps, but the urgency of wartime had often blurred such lines, and the habit of solitary, focused work died hard. He was meticulously, painstakingly, building a wall around the plutonium sphere. Not of brick and mortar, but of something far denser, tungsten carbide. Each brick, heavy and rectangular, was a neutron reflector. The core was constantly fizzing with stray neutrons, particles flying off from its unstable heart. Most simply escaped, lost to the vastness of the lab. But the tungsten carbide bricks acted like mirrors, catching these escaping particles and bouncing them back into the plutonium. With each brick he added, the core's internal activity grew. The clicks on his neutron counters, his only eyes and ears on the subatomic world, became more frequent, a staccato rhythm accelerating into a frantic drumbeat. He was pushing the sphere closer and closer to criticality, that knife-edge state where its nuclear chain reaction would become self-sustaining. The goal was to find the precise point where the dragon would stir, but not fully awaken. He had built 3 walls of the reflector, carefully monitoring his instruments with each placement. Now he was working on the 4th and final wall. The clicks from the counters were a near-constant hum. He was in the zone, a place of pure scientific immersion where the outside world falls away and only the problem remains. He held the final brick in his right hand. It was just another piece of the puzzle, a 5-kilogram block of metal that felt solid, real, predictable. He moved to place it atop the assembly. His instruments were screaming that he was perilously close to the edge. He knew it. This was the moment of discovery. And then it happened. A moment so small, so mundane, it was almost absurd. His hand, perhaps slick with a bit of sweat, or just caught at an awkward angle, slipped. The brick, that dense, heavy weight, fell from his grasp. It was a drop of no more than a few inches, a clumsy accident that would have been meaningless anywhere else on Earth. But here, in this precise location, it was the trigger for a cosmic event. It landed directly on top of the plutonium sphere completing the reflector cage. In that instant, the dragon awoke. The universe inside the laboratory was torn apart and remade. There was no explosion, no sound beyond the dull clank of metal on metal. There was only light. A silent, ghostly, impossible blue flash erupted from the assembly, illuminating every corner of the room in its spectral glow. This was not the light of a fire or a bulb. This was Cherenkov radiation, the optical shockwave produced when particles are forced to travel faster than the speed of light, in a medium. In this case, the very air in the room. You're seeing the air itself scream. It was a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the violent heart of the atom. It lasted for less than 1/10 of a second, a phantom wave of ionized air, a silent, ghostly cerulean fire. Simultaneously, a wave of intense heat washed over him, a searing blast that felt like opening an oven door directly into his face. It was the physical manifestation of a burst of gamma rays and neutrons, punching through the air, through his clothes, through his very skin. In that flicker of time, the core had become a microscopic star, burning with a ferocity that defied all terrestrial experience. Instinct, primal and immediate, took over where conscious thought had failed. Without thinking, Daghlian thrust his hand forward, sweeping the fallen brick off the assembly and onto the floor. The frantic clicking of the neutron counters subsided, the dragon returning to its slumber. Silence flooded back into the room, a profound, heavy silence that felt different now, tainted. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, the lingering ghost of the blue flash. He stood there for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at his right hand, the one he had used to push the brick away. It was already beginning to tingle, an alien pins and needles sensation that crawled up his arm. And in that moment, the true horror descended. Harry Daghlian was a physicist. He was not a soldier caught in an enemy blast, or a civilian stumbling into a hazard. He understood, with chilling academic precision, exactly what had just happened to him. The blue light was not just a strange phenomenon, it was the visible signature of his own death sentence. The heat was not a burn, it was the precursor to his cells being torn apart from the inside. He could almost feel the trillions of high-energy particles that had just shot through his body like phantom bullets, shredding DNA, rupturing cell walls, rewriting the fundamental code of his own biology. He knew the physics, he knew the numbers. He could likely, in his head, make a horrifyingly accurate estimate of the dose he had just received. It was a unique and terrible form of torture, to be armed with a perfect intellectual framework to comprehend your own irreversible dissolution. He calmly began to dismantle the rest of the experiment, putting the tools of his own execution away. His mind, trained for logic and reason, was trying to impose order on a fundamentally chaotic event. But his body had already begun its rebellion. A wave of nausea swept over him. He left the lab, locking the door behind him, and encountered the site's security guard, Private Robert Hemmerly, on his rounds. Their exchange was surreal in its normalcy. A simple greeting, a comment on the late hour. Daghlian didn't scream, didn't panic. He simply told Hemmerly that he thought he was in for some trouble and showed the guard his hand, which was now visibly swelling and turning a painful shade of red. He drove himself back to his lodgings, the tingling in his arm now a burning ache. He was a dead man driving, he knew it. The only question was how long it would take. By the time he reached the Los Alamos hospital, the initial violent phase of his body's response was in full swing. He was vomiting, his skin flushed, his hand now a grotesque blistered claw. The doctors, pioneers in this terrifying new field of radiation medicine, could do little more than observe and try to manage the symptoms. They were mapping a new continent of human suffering, and Harry Daghlian was its first unwilling explorer. He gave them a lucid, precise account of the accident, a physicist report on his own demise. He estimated the duration of the flash, the distance he was from the core, the configuration of the bricks. From his data, his colleagues would later calculate the dose. His whole body had absorbed about 200 rads, but his right hand, his brave, foolish hand, had taken an unbelievable, unsurvivable dose, somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 rads. Then came the cruelest phase of acute radiation sickness. After about 2 days, the initial violent symptoms subsided. The vomiting stopped. His temperature returned to normal. A strange, deceptive calm settled over him. This is the latency period, the walking ghost phase. For a few precious days, it might have seemed like he was recovering, that the crisis had passed. His family rushed to his side, his mother and sister clinging to this fragile hope. He was lucid, able to talk with them, to converse with the scientists who came to his bedside, hungry for data, yet horrified by the human cost of their new science. They were his friends, his colleagues, and they now looked at him with a mixture of pity and a kind of terrible clinical fascination. He was no longer just Harry. He was a living laboratory, a human case study in the effects of a massive neutron burst. But beneath the surface of this false recovery, a silent, systematic demolition was underway. The radiation had inflicted its most profound damage on the parts of his body that reproduced the fastest. Chief among them was his bone marrow, the very foundry of life that creates red and white blood cells. It had been sterilized, shut down as completely as if it had been scorched from his bones. His immune system, deprived of new white blood cells, simply collapsed. He was left utterly defenseless, not against the radiation itself, but against the billions of ordinary harmless bacteria that live on and inside every human being. His own internal ecosystem became his enemy. Then, the lining of his gastrointestinal tract began to slough away, unable to regenerate. He was dissolving from the inside out. The visible effects were horrific. His left hand, which had been further from the blast, blistered and swelled, the skin peeling off in wet sheets. But it was his right hand that became a symbol of this new atomic horror. It turned from red to purple to black. The tissue died, gangrene set in. The pain was beyond comprehension, a deep cellular agony that even the highest doses of morphine could barely touch. His body, desperate and confused, was trying to fight an enemy it could not comprehend, and in doing so was tearing itself apart. He fell into a coma. His hair fell out. His body wasted away. He was attended by men in sterile gowns, his friends and family watching through a glass partition, helpless witnesses to the inexorable, predictable shutdown of a human being. On September 15th, 1945, 25 days after his hand slipped, Harry Daghlian died. He was the first American to die from a criticality accident, the first casualty of the atomic age in a time of peace. His death sent a shockwave of grief and fear through the close-knit community at Los Alamos. These were not faceless bureaucrats. They were young men and women who had worked and lived together through the intense pressure of the war. Daghlian was one of them. His death was a personal tragedy, but it was also a terrifying professional warning. An investigation was launched, headed by the physicist Otto Frisch, the man who had first explained the physics of nuclear fission. The conclusions were stark and unavoidable. The experiment itself was inherently risky, the safety margins too thin. And crucially, Daghlian had been working alone, with no one to help him or to warn him as he approached the point of no return. New rules were immediately put into place. Henceforth, no criticality experiment would be performed by a lone researcher. A minimum of 2 people must always be present. Mechanical safety features were discussed, ways to use remote handling, or to design assemblies that could not physically be pushed into a supercritical state by a simple, clumsy error. There was a solemn sense that a lesson had been learned, that Daghlian's agonizing death would serve as a permanent cautionary barrier. They believed they now understood the dragon better, that they had measured the length of its teeth and the heat of its breath. They would be more careful. They would be safer. They would honour their fallen friend by respecting the terrible power they had all worked so hard to unleash. But the core itself, the gleaming plutonium sphere that had flashed with blue light in that silent laboratory, remained unchanged. It sat in its storage container, an object of immense scientific interest, now shrouded in a grim new aura. It had killed once. And it was waiting. The ghost of Harry Daghlian did not just haunt the long, quiet corridors of the Pajarito site. It saturated the very air of Los Alamos. His death, a slow and agonizing surrender to an invisible fire, had transformed their work. What was once the domain of pure, exhilarating science, the pursuit of knowledge at the very frontier of creation, was now shadowed by a visceral, undeniable dread. Yet, the object at the centre of that tragedy, the 6.2 kilogram sphere of plutonium and gallium, did not vanish. It could not. The war in the Pacific had ended, but the world had not exhaled in relief. Instead, it held its breath, entering a new and colder conflict, a chess match where the pieces were cities and the ultimate checkmate was atomic fire. This small, warm sphere was a crucial pawn, a vital component for the upcoming Crossroads nuclear tests. Its properties, its every subtle energetic tremor had to be intimately known. The experiment that had claimed one life was deemed too important to abandon. The work, impossibly, had to go on. And so, the core sat in its magnesium cradle, a silent monarch of a terrified court. The physicists who had once approached it with a sense of bold discovery now saw it through a different lens. They saw the blue flash Daghlian had described. They felt the phantom warmth on their skin. The sphere was no longer just a triumph of metallurgical engineering. It had acquired a personality, a malevolent agency born from the tragedy it had authored. It was in these hushed, fearful conversations that it was given the name that would cling to it throughout history, a name whispered with a mixture of gallows humour and genuine terror. They stopped calling it Rufus. They started calling it the Demon Core. It was a name that fit. The core seemed to demand a toll, a sacrifice of flesh and blood in exchange for the secrets held within its atomic heart. The question that hung in the thin mountain air was not if it would claim another victim, but who would be foolish enough to offer themselves next? Who would step into the empty laboratory space left by Daghlian and willingly place their hands near a sleeping dragon? The answer came in the form of Louis Alexander Slotin, a Canadian physicist with a reputation as brilliant as it was reckless. Where Daghlian had been methodical and cautious, Slotin was a showman, an atomic cowboy with an almost preternatural calm in the face of immense danger. He was already a legend at Los Alamos, the man who had assembled the core for the world's first nuclear detonation, the Trinity test. He had done it by hand, on his knees in a dusty tower in the New Mexico desert, armed with little more than his intellect and an unshakable confidence in his own abilities. He had handled the most dangerous objects ever created by humanity, and had walked away unscathed every time. He possessed a kind of physical intuition, a feel for the nuclear forces at play that seemed to transcend mere calculation. While others saw a murderous sphere of metal, Slotin saw a puzzle, a challenge to be mastered. He saw an adversary he was certain he could outwit. He looked at Daghlian's experiment, the careful stacking of tungsten carbide bricks, and saw its fatal flaw, its slowness, its ponderous indirection. Daghlian had been killed by a moment of gravitational betrayal, a simple slip of a heavy brick that fell at the worst possible instant. Slotin believed he could devise a system that was faster, more responsive, and gave him more direct tactile control. He wanted to feel the edge of criticality, to bring the core to the very brink of a chain reaction and pull it back with the flick of a wrist. His solution was audacious in its simplicity, terrifying in its implications. He would discard the heavy, cumbersome bricks entirely. Instead, he would take the core, nestled within its lower hemisphere of beryllium, and place the larger, hollowed-out upper hemisphere directly on top of it. These two beryllium shells, when fully united, would act as a neutron reflector, a perfect cage that would bounce escaping neutrons back into the plutonium, instantly pushing the assembly into a supercritical state. It would, for all intents and purposes, become a functioning, low-power nuclear reactor, a bomb on the verge of detonating. The key to Slotin's entire procedure, the single point of failure between a successful measurement and a lethal blast of radiation, was preventing those two hemispheres from closing completely. He needed a way to hold them apart by the thinnest of margins, a gap that could be adjusted with microscopic precision. His chosen instrument for this task was not a custom machined wedge, not a geared lifting mechanism, not any of the fail-safes one might imagine. It was a standard, workshop-grade, flathead screwdriver. The protocol was as elegant as it was horrifying. Slotin would use one hand to steady the upper beryllium shell through a thumb hole at its apex. With his other hand, he would wedge the blade of the screwdriver between the lips of the two hemispheres, prying them apart. By twisting his wrist, by minutely raising or lowering the screwdriver's handle, he could control the gap between the two beryllium shells with exquisite finesse. He could allow them to approach each other, listening to the rising crescendo of the Geiger counter, feeling the assembly come alive. He was not just measuring the core's reactivity, he was conducting it, playing it like a musical instrument where a single sour note meant a fatal dose of gamma rays and neutrons. This procedure, which he performed dozens of times, became a kind of performance art. It was a spectacle of supreme confidence. Young scientists and technicians would gather to watch, mesmerized by Slotin's steady hand and casual demeanor. He would often perform the experiment in blue jeans and cowboy boots, his focus absolute, his movements fluid and economical. He called it tickling the dragon's tail, a phrase that perfectly captured the blend of bravado and mortal risk involved. You could get close enough to feel its heat, to hear its rumbling breath, but you had to be certain you could pull away before it awoke. For Slotin, it was the ultimate test of skill. The clicking of the neutron detectors was his applause, the silence of the room his stage. He was the master of this atomic beast, the one man who could look into the abyss without flinching. His method was, in a purely mechanical sense, faster and more direct than Daghlian's. But it concentrated the entire margin of safety not in the laws of physics or the integrity of equipment, but in the fallible sinew and bone of a single human wrist. It removed all redundancy, all external checks. The life of everyone in the room rested on the unyielding friction between a steel screwdriver blade and a beryllium hemisphere. The psychological impact on the laboratory was profound and complex. On one hand, Slotin's fearlessness was a stabilizing force. His willingness to take on the demon directly seemed to domesticate it, to bring it back into the realm of human control after the terrifying randomness of Daghlian's accident. He had tamed the monster. His confidence was infectious, creating a bubble of normalcy around a fundamentally abnormal and dangerous task. The work continued, data was gathered, and the Crossroads test schedule remained on track. But beneath this veneer of controlled risk, a deep and corrosive unease began to fester. The nickname for the core had stuck, and with each successful tickling, the legend of the demon grew. It felt as though the core were merely biding its time, letting this arrogant human play his games, waiting for its moment. The very ritual Slotin had created became a source of anxiety for his colleagues. They saw the lack of shims, the absence of mechanical stops that would prevent the hemispheres from closing if his hand slipped. They saw a man relying on muscle memory and nerve to govern a force that respected neither. His close friend and fellow physicist Enrico Fermi, the architect of the world's first nuclear reactor, had warned Slotin directly. He argued that Slotin and everyone in the room with him were courting disaster, that they would be dead within a year if they continued the experiments in this manner. The warnings were not born of ignorance but of a deep foundational understanding of probability. Fermi knew that no matter how skilled a person is, human beings make mistakes. Hands tremble, minds wander for a fraction of a second. A sudden noise, a cough, a momentary distraction, any of these could be a death sentence. Another colleague, the brilliant and iconoclastic Richard Feynman, was equally appalled. He compared the procedure to poking a sleeping rattlesnake, privately referring to Slotin as the chief arm twister of the United States, a man whose theatrical bravery was indistinguishable from suicidal recklessness. He actively worked on developing remote-controlled systems, machines that could perform these critical tests from a safe distance, removing the fragile human element from the equation entirely. These systems, ironically codenamed Jodiva devices, were the future. They were the logical, safe, and sane evolution of the science. But Slotin resisted. He was a product of a different era of science, an era of hands-on empiricism where the scientist was an active participant, not a remote observer. He trusted his own senses, his own physical intuition, more than any machine. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps after the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the death of his colleague, this direct physical confrontation with the power he had helped unleash was a form of penance, or a way of asserting his own humanity against the inhuman scale of the atom. To him, the risk was the point. It sharpened his senses, focused his mind. He had become comfortable on the knife's edge, so much so that he seemed to forget the chasm that lay on either side. His confidence, once a source of comfort for his team, began to feel like a dangerous liability. The very scientists who had once admired his nerve now watched him with a growing sense of foreboding. They saw a man locked in a personal duel with a piece of metal, a man who had performed his high-wire act so many times he had started to believe he could not fall. The pressure from above did not help. The military and political machinery behind the nuclear program demanded results, not excuses. The Cold War was dawning, and the American nuclear arsenal had to be tested, understood, and perfected. The Demon Core was not just a laboratory curiosity. It was a weapon in waiting, and its precise trigger point was a non-negotiable piece of data. This institutional momentum pushed men like Slotin to continue taking risks that, in a saner world, would have been unthinkable. The entire culture of Los Alamos, born in the crucible of a desperate war, was steeped in a philosophy of can-do improvisation and calculated risk. They had done the impossible once by building the bomb. Now, they were expected to continue doing it every single day, managing the very forces of creation in makeshift labs with rudimentary tools. The screwdriver was not just Louis Slotin's chosen instrument, it was a perfect symbol for the entire endeavour, a common, everyday object being used to control an almost supernatural power. It was a testament to both human ingenuity and human arrogance. As the spring of 1946 blossomed across the high desert mesas, a sense of grim routine settled over the experiments. Slotin had successfully performed the test over 60 times. The dragon's tail had been tickled again and again, and each time the beast had remained asleep. The procedure became less a spectacle and more a chore, the danger normalized through repetition. But the laws of physics are not subject to familiarity or contempt. The neutron flux inside the core did not care about Louis Slotin's steady hand or his legendary nerve. The demon was patient. It obeyed only probability and quantum mechanics, and probability, given enough chances, always has its day. The unease that had been a low hum in the background of the Pajarito laboratory was beginning to intensify, becoming a palpable tension that clung to the concrete walls. Something had to give. The delicate balance between human skill and atomic fury was being strained to its absolute limit. And on a bright Tuesday afternoon, the 21st of May, Louis Slotin would walk into that room one last time. He would gather his team, pick up his screwdriver and approach the core, ready to perform the familiar ritual, but this time the dragon was waiting. The confidence you see had become a kind of armour. For Louis Slotin, the 9 months since Harry Daghlian's death were not a period of mourning so much as a reinforcement of his own exceptionalism. He had dissected the first accident, understood its mechanics, and convinced himself that its cause was a simple, tragic error of judgment, a mistake he was incapable of making. He was the chief armourer of the United States, the man who knew the plutonium pit better than any soul alive. He had assembled the Trinity test device with his own hands, and now this small warm sphere was his personal domain. The procedure, which others now viewed with a chilling reverence, had become for him a demonstration of mastery, a lecture performed with the most dangerous teaching aid in history. It was a performance he had perfected. On May 21st, 1946, inside the same remote Pajarito Canyon laboratory, the stage was set for an encore. The audience was a small assembly of scientists and engineers, including Alvin Graves, who was slated to be Slotin's replacement. This was to be a transfer of knowledge, a final lesson from the master before he moved on from Los Alamos. The core, that polished orb of harnessed stellar fury, sat waiting on its stand. Above it, the larger of the two beryllium hemispheres, a heavy dome-like neutron reflector was already in place. The smaller upper hemisphere rested in Slotin's hand. Between the two nested shells, keeping them from embracing the plutonium in a critical union, was the tip of his flat-headed screwdriver. This was his signature technique, a method defined by its utter reliance on the surgeon's steady hand. Official protocol now demanded the use of shims, calibrated spacers to prevent the hemispheres from ever closing completely. But for Slotin, such precautions were an insult to his craft. He preferred the intimacy of the screwdriver, the direct tactile feedback it provided, the feeling of the system breathing just beneath the threshold of oblivion. The air in the room was casual, almost mundane. This was physics as a workshop craft, a far cry from the abstract equations that governed it. The men watched, some perched on stools, as Slotin began his familiar lecture. He spoke of the neutron flux, the delicate dance of reflection and absorption. With his left thumb hooked into a cavity on the upper shell, and his right hand guiding the screwdriver, he expertly lowered the beryllium cap, letting it pivot on the steel blade. He could feel it in his fingertips, the subtle change in the core's energy, the faint warmth radiating through the metal, the imperceptible hum of a system nearing its tipping point. He was coaxing the dragon, letting his colleagues hear its purr without ever fully waking it. He moved the shell up and down by millimeters, the neutron counters on the wall chattering their confirmation, their clicks rising and falling in perfect synchrony with his movements, a staccato heartbeat for the atomic age. It was a display of profound, almost arrogant control over a power that had leveled cities. Then, in a sliver of time too small to measure, too fast for the conscious mind to process, the universe pivoted. Perhaps it was a subtle shift in his weight, a momentary lapse in concentration, or the simple, unforgiving physics of friction and gravity. The screwdriver, that steel bond between safety and catastrophe, slipped. Its blade slid just a fraction of an inch from its precarious perch on the lower hemisphere's rim. The metallic scrape was an insignificant sound, a footnote to the instantaneous consequence. Freed from its restraint, the upper beryllium shell dropped. With a soft, final thunk, it fell completely into place, fully nesting over the bottom shell. For one infinitesimal moment, the demon core was perfectly, seamlessly encased. The dragon was not just awake, it was uncaged. A silent thunderclap of pure energy detonated in the center of the room. It was not an explosion of fire and force, but something far more alien, far more intimate. The very air ionized, erupting into a blinding, beautiful, and utterly terrifying flash of blue light. This was Cherenkov radiation, the optical shockwave created by subatomic particles, neutrons, gamma rays, ripped from the core's heart and moving faster than the speed of the light through the medium of the observer's own eyes. For the men in that room, the light did not simply illuminate them, it was born inside them. The burst lasted perhaps a tenth of a second, just long enough to sear a permanent afterimage onto their retinas. In that same instant, an intense wave of heat washed over them, a phantom sunburn from an ephemeral ghost star born and extinguished in their midst. The plutonium core, provoked by the perfect geometry of its beryllium cage, had breached the threshold. For a fleeting, lethal moment, it had gone supercritical, unleashing a furious, silent scream of radiation. Instinct, forged in the crucible of the Manhattan Project, overrode shock. Before the blue glow had even faded from his vision, Slotin's body reacted. He jerked his hand upward, a violent reflexive motion that knocked the top hemisphere off the assembly and onto the floor with a heavy clang. He had broken the critical geometry. He had quenched the chain reaction. He had, in that single desperate act, saved the lives of the 7 other men in the room from an immediately fatal dose. The neutron counters, which had screamed off the scale, fell silent. The air, once electric, was now thick with an unnerving stillness, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. The silence was shattered by Slotin's voice, sharp and steady, betraying no panic. "Well," he said, his words cutting through the daze, "that does it." A profound calm had settled over him, the eerie tranquility of a man who has just looked over the edge and understood, with absolute certainty, that he has already fallen. He turned to Alvin Graves, who was standing closest to him. The metallic, ozone-like taste of ionized air was thick in their mouths. Slotin knew the physics. He knew the inverse square law of radiation exposure as well as he knew his own name. He had been at the epicenter. While he had shielded the others with his own body, he had absorbed the lion's share of the blast, a biblical dose of gamma and neutron radiation. His fate was sealed. Chaos gave way to a chillingly methodical procedure of self-diagnosis. There was no protocol for this, no emergency plan. They were the experts, and they had just become their own subjects in the world's most horrific unplanned experiment. Slotin, the lead scientist, remained in command. He grabbed a piece of chalk and strode to a blackboard. With a hand that had not yet begun to tremble, he sketched a diagram of the room, marking the exact position of the core. He then directed each of the 7 men to mark their own position relative to the experiment at the moment of the flash. It was a grim, surreal exercise in nuclear forensics. They were creating a map of their own poisoning, calculating the invisible trajectories of the particles that had just shot through their cells. Slotin, standing directly over the device, drew an X for himself. His chalk circle encompassed the very origin point of the burst. He knew, better than anyone, what that proximity meant. He was no longer just a physicist. He was a walking, talking ionization chamber. The first wave of symptoms arrived with brutal speed. As the adrenaline subsided, Slotin was overcome by a powerful nausea. He was vomiting before he even left the laboratory building. The intense radiation had delivered a catastrophic shock to his central nervous system and gastrointestinal tract, the body's frontline defenses. But it was the invisible damage that was truly terrifying. The torrent of high-energy neutrons had behaved like subatomic shrapnel, tearing through his tissues. They didn't just pass through, they collided with the nuclei of atoms within his cells, transmuting stable elements into radioactive isotopes. In essence, Louis Slotin himself had become radioactive. His blood, his sweat, his breath. They were now faintly emitting radiation as the newly unstable atoms within him began to decay. He was rushed to the Los Alamos hospital, the same ward where Harry Daghlian had spent his final weeks. The parallel was not lost on anyone. A dreadful sense of déjà vu descended upon the project's medical staff. They knew the pathology. They had seen this story before. Initially, after the first violent bout of sickness, an eerie calm would descend. This was the walking ghost phase, a latency period where the victim feels deceptively well as the initial shock to the system subsides. Slotin's mind remained lucid, sharp as ever. He provided doctors with meticulous blow-by-blow accounts of the accident, offering precise calculations of the neutron flux and the fusion, events he estimated had occurred within the core. He was, in effect, documenting his own execution, providing the scientific data for his own autopsy while he was still alive. He insisted on wearing his security badge, clipped to his hospital pajamas, a final, poignant link to the world of controlled science that he had so catastrophically left behind. But the ghost phase was a cruel mirage. Underneath the surface, a cellular civil war was raging. The radiation had shredded the DNA in his bone marrow, the factory of his blood. His white blood cell count, the body's army, plummeted. His platelet count, essential for clotting, vanished. His body had lost the ability to defend itself, to heal, to maintain its own integrity. His hands, the skilled hands that had worked the screwdriver, began to swell. They turned red, then waxy and white, as massive blisters formed, radiation burns that came not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The neutrons had delivered their most vicious assault to his arms and torso. His flesh was cooking itself. By the 5th day, the true horror of his condition became undeniable. He was in constant, excruciating pain. The lining of his intestines, another area of rapid cell division, was sloughing away, leading to uncontrollable internal bleeding. A raging fever took hold, a sign of massive systemic infection against which his body now had zero defence. His parents were flown in from Winnipeg, arriving to find not their brilliant, confident son, but a man being systematically dismantled by the invisible forces he had sought to command. His mind, the physicist's brilliant engine, began to cloud. He drifted in and out of a delirium, his body racked by tremors. Nurses and doctors, pioneers in this new and terrifying field of radiation medicine, could do nothing but try to manage his pain and bear witness to the inexorable biological unravelling. On the 9th day after the accident, the same number of days Harry Daghlian had survived, Louis Slotin's ordeal came to an end. His body, ravaged beyond recovery, finally surrendered. His internal organs had failed. His blood was no longer a life-giving fluid, but a useless, broken medium. He was 35 years old. The man who had tamed the dragon's tail had been consumed by its fire. The second victim of the demon core had followed the first into the atomic darkness. The experiment had been concluded. 2 identical data points now existed, drawn from the lives of 2 brilliant men, proving with absolute finality that humanity's grasp on the atom was every bit as precarious as a screwdriver's edge. It was a final, terrible lesson written in the language of decaying isotopes, a lesson that would force Los Alamos and the world to confront the true cost of wielding a power meant for the stars. And so, with Louis Slotin's last breath, a terrible silence fell over the canyons of Los Alamos. The frenetic, wartime urgency that had driven these brilliant minds to the very edge of creation, and now, twice, over the precipice of destruction, finally broke. It was a silence filled not with peace, but with the weight of a profound and irreversible truth. The casual intimacy with the atom was over. The era of the cowboy physicist, of trusting instinct and a steady hand to tame the fundamental forces of the universe, had ended in agony. It had died 9 days after that flash of blue light, in the same hospital bed where Harry Daghlian's own hopes had dissolved into radiation burns and organ failure 9 months prior. The demon had claimed its second soul, and in doing so it had shattered the myth of control forever. Back in Pajarito Canyon, the core itself, the sphere of plutonium-gallium alloy, now infamous across the clandestine scientific community, sat waiting. It was no longer just a piece of an experiment or a component for a future weapon. It had become a relic, a cursed artifact radiating a story of tragedy. Men who had once handled it with a cavalier confidence now spoke of it in whispers, refusing to enter the room where it was stored, as if its malevolence was a palpable, lingering presence. The name they had given it in gallows humour, the demon core, was no longer a joke. It had earned its title, written in the irradiated blood of 2 of its masters. The raw, visceral grief for Slotin, a man known for his charisma and his daring, quickly crystallised into a cold, hard resolve within the laboratory's leadership. Another accident of this nature was not just unacceptable, it was unthinkable. The core, originally destined for the Able nuclear test in the Crossroads series, was now a pariah. Its brief, lethal history had rendered it too psychologically toxic for use. The risk, once a calculated number on a blackboard, now had a human face, a memory of searing pain, and the sound of a final laboured breath. The order was given. The demon was to be unmade. Its final journey was a somber, meticulously planned affair, the very antithesis of the swashbuckling experiments that had sealed its fate. There were no screwdrivers, no casually stacked tungsten carbide bricks, no last-minute adjustments made by human hands. Instead, the procedures developed for this final act were a blueprint for a new age of nuclear science, an age born from trauma. Remote manipulators, complex mechanical arms that would come to be known as Waldos. were brought in to perform the delicate final surgery. Engineers and physicists watched on monitors from a safe room, their hands guiding the metallic claws with a caution that bordered on reverence. They were not just disassembling a potential weapon, they were deconsecrating a haunted object, performing a technological exorcism. The core was carefully separated from its neutron-reflecting tamper, its ability to flirt with prompt criticality forever neutralized. Each component was logged, measured, and secured with a level of painstaking documentation that was itself a testament to the lessons learned. The sphere of plutonium, warm to the touch not from criticality but from its own steady alpha decay, was finally melted down. Its perfectly machined form, a testament to the pinnacle of wartime metallurgy, was surrendered to the crucible. Its atoms, each one a potential seed of catastrophic energy, were blended with other fissile materials, diluted and dispersed. The singular identity of the demon core was deliberately, methodically erased from the physical world, its potent material scattered into the larger US nuclear stockpile. The dragon was not merely caged, it was dissected, its heart rendered down and its essence scattered to the winds, ensuring it could never again concentrate its terrible power in one place. But you cannot truly destroy a story, you cannot melt down a lesson. While the atoms of the core were recycled, its ghost remained, an indelible spectre that would haunt the hallways of every nuclear facility built from that day forward. That ghost became the architect of our entire modern approach to nuclear safety. Before Daghlian and Slotin, the field was akin to aviation in its earliest days, a realm of heroic, individualistic pioneers pushing untested machines to their limits, with tragic failures seen as a lamentable but necessary cost of progress. After their deaths, the discipline of nuclear engineering was forced to mature overnight. The most immediate and lasting change was the absolute prohibition of manual criticality experiments. The very concept of a human being in the same room as a critical assembly, using their own body as the final failsafe, was now viewed with the horror it always deserved. The new doctrine was one of distance, shielding, and remote control. The image of the scientist, intimately connected to their apparatus, was replaced by the image of the operator, separated by feet of concrete and leaded glass, their touch extended only through servo motors and steel claws. This was not merely a procedural shift, it was a profound philosophical one. It was an admission that the forces at play were not fires to be tamed by a steady hand, but cosmic energies that operated on a level of speed and power fundamentally incompatible with human reflexes. The 9 days it took Louis Slotin to die were an eternity compared to the microseconds in which his fate was sealed. The new systems acknowledged this terrifying mismatch. Emergency shutdown mechanisms, known as scrams, were designed to be faster than any human thought, flooding assemblies with neutron-absorbing materials at the slightest hint of an unplanned power excursion. Some of these systems, in a poignant tribute, were informally called Slotin scrams, forever linking his name not to the accident, but to the life-saving prevention that rose from its ashes. The change rippled outward, embedding itself into the very culture of science, where once a single, confident physicist like Slotin could design and execute an experiment, now teams and committees were required. Checklists, peer reviews, and rigorous safety analyses became mandatory prerequisites. Every step of a procedure had to be rehearsed, every contingency planned for. The two-man rule, ensuring no single individual could perform a critical operation alone, became standard practice. This was the birth of the institutional safety culture that defines all high-stakes technological fields today, from spaceflight to genetic engineering. It was a covenant written in irradiated tissue, a promise made to the memories of the fallen that their sacrifice would build a safer world for those who followed. We, who live in an age of nuclear power plants with multiply redundant safety systems and international oversight, are the direct beneficiaries of this painful legacy. The protocols that protect technicians at a reactor in France, or scientists at a particle accelerator in Switzerland, can trace their lineage directly back to that small, unguarded room in New Mexico. The ghosts of Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin stand silent watch in every control room on the planet. Their deaths forced us to develop a conscience for the atom, to temper our ambition with a healthy, life-sustaining fear. They taught us that the most brilliant mind is no match for a single microsecond of uncontrolled physics. This hard-won wisdom, this deep-seated institutional caution, is their true and enduring monument, far more powerful than any bronze statue or engraved plaque. It is a living legacy, reenacted every day in the quiet, careful procedures that keep the demon chained. Yet, to remember them only for the safety rules they inspired is to do their memory a disservice. It is too easy to cast Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin as simple cautionary tales, as tragic figures defined solely by their final, fatal mistakes. This narrative is comforting, for it allows us to believe we are wiser, more careful, and that such a thing could never happen to us. But the truth is far more complex and far more human. They were not merely victims. They were explorers of the highest order, charting a territory more alien and more dangerous than any earthly continent. They worked at the absolute frontier of human knowledge in a time of immense national pressure, where the rulebook for this new world was being written as they went along. There were no established traditions, no generations of accumulated wisdom to guide them. They were the first. Every action they took, every piece of data they gathered, was a step into the unknown. We must see them as they were, brilliant, driven, courageous, and flawed human beings caught in the crucible of history. They were working under the long shadow of a world war that had just concluded and the dawn of a Cold War that was just beginning. The urgency to understand and control the atom was not an abstract scientific curiosity. It was a perceived national imperative. They believed, as did everyone around them, that their work was essential to preserving peace in a newly terrifying world. This context does not excuse the risks they took, but it helps us understand them. Slotin, in particular, embodied the archetype of the frontier scientist. He had disarmed a bomb with his bare hands during the Trinity test. He was known as the chief armourer of the United States for his expertise in assembling the intricate cores of nuclear weapons. His confidence was not arrogance for its own sake. It was forged in the high-pressure environment of the Manhattan Project, where improvisation and decisive action were lauded as virtues. The technique he used, the one that killed him, was a shortcut born of that same can-do culture. It was faster, it gave a better feel for the assembly's approach to criticality, and in the frantic race to gather data, speed was a powerful temptation. They were pushing the boundaries not just of physics, but of human endurance and judgment. Their story is a poignant, painful reminder that scientific discovery is not a clean, linear process conducted by infallible beings in sterile labs. It is a messy, human endeavour, often driven by the same powerful emotions that govern all of our lives: ambition, curiosity, pride, and a desperate desire to make a difference in the world. Daghlian and Slotin did not die because they were foolish. They died because they were pioneers. And like so many pioneers before them, from the first mariners who sailed off the edge of the map to the first test pilots who broke the sound barrier, they paid the ultimate price for venturing one step too far into the wilderness. Their legacy is not a warning against exploration, but a solemn testament to its inherent costs. And here, in the echo of their story, lies the central enduring question that the discovery of nuclear fission forced upon all of humanity. It is a question that reverberates through every major scientific advance of the modern age, from the laboratories of Los Alamos to the server farms of Silicon Valley. What is the proper balance between the quest for knowledge and the preservation of safety? How far is too far? At what point does the potential reward of a discovery become overshadowed by the unforgivable nature of its risk? The Demon Core serves as the perfect, terrible parable for this dilemma. In its gleaming, deceptively simple form, it represented a power that humanity had dreamed of for millennia, the ability to command the very energy that fuels the stars. Unlocking that secret promised an end to war, limitless energy, a mastery over the material world. Yet, the path to that mastery was littered with lethal, invisible traps. The very act of studying the power, of trying to understand its nuances, was an act of profound danger. There is a fundamental tension, a tragic paradox, at the heart of our species' relationship with knowledge. To learn, we must experiment. To experiment, we must take risks. But when the subject of our experiments holds the potential for catastrophic, irreversible harm, we are forced to confront the limits of our own wisdom. Can we, a species prone to error, hubris, and miscalculation, truly be trusted as the custodians of such power? The deaths of these two physicists were a microcosm of this larger philosophical crisis. They forced the scientific community to engage in a painful self-reflection, to ask whether their relentless drive to know had blinded them to their more fundamental responsibility to protect. This debate did not end when the core was melted down. It continues today in every discussion about artificial intelligence, CRISPR gene editing, or geoengineering our climate. Each of these fields holds the promise of revolutionary benefits for humankind, and each carries risks of a magnitude that are difficult to fully comprehend. We, like the scientists at Los Alamos, stand at the edge of a new frontier, holding tools of immense power whose long-term consequences are still shrouded in uncertainty. We tell ourselves we have learned the lessons of the past. We have ethics boards, international treaties, and rigorous safety protocols. We have, in essence, institutionalized the ghost of the demon core. But the fundamental human elements, ambition, competition, the intoxicating lure of being the first to discover something new, remain unchanged. The story of the demon core is therefore not just a history lesson. It is a perpetual warning. It is a reminder that the most important component in any great scientific experiment is not the exotic material or the complex machinery, but the humility of the scientist. It is the wisdom to recognize that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and that the price of knowledge can sometimes be paid not just by the explorer, but by all of us. In the end, what are we left with? Two names, etched into the long, often bloody history of science: Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin. They were not saints or martyrs in the classical sense. They were brilliant, dedicated men who, for a few fateful seconds, lost control of a force they were trying to master. They represent the human cost of unlocking the universe's most formidable secret. Their story forces us to gaze into the heart of the atomic fire we so proudly ignited, and to see not just the immense power, but also the profound fragility of our own existence. We reached for the power of the gods and found that it burned. We now live in the world they helped create, a world perpetually balanced on the knife's edge between Promethean promise and apocalyptic peril. The demon core is gone, its atoms scattered, its physical threat erased, but its legacy is immortal. It exists as a deep and abiding question mark hanging over our entire technological civilization. It is the chilling whisper in the background of our greatest achievements, reminding us that every great leap forward requires a moment of looking down into the abyss, and it is the solemn, human story of two lives given, not in war, but in the relentless, terrifying, and awe-inspiring pursuit of knowledge itself, a pursuit that continues to define who we are and to shape the uncertain contours of our future.